Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and this is our monthly Rabbi's Cantors series. As always, I want to thank all of you for being here and for your support of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, either as a member of SHJ directly or a member of one of our affiliated communities or a donor or supporter of SHJ. This is a program specifically for you as a thank you for your support. We are a nonprofit and we rely on not just membership dues, but also donations. Above that, these programs are recorded and put on our YouTube channel afterwards so that everybody can access them. But we did want to give a thank you for folks to acknowledge that there is an appreciation of our members for your support. So today, I am excited and honored to welcome Rabbi Eva Cohen. Rabbi Cohen is the leader of Oramet, Minnesota Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. She is Oramet's first rabbi and the first humanistic rabbi in Minnesota. Rabbi Cohen grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and graduated from Brown University with a BA in anthropology and visual art in 2009. After graduation, she returned to the Twin Cities and spent the next decade working in nonprofits and as an artist while participating in local activism, including for LGBTQ marriage equality. She reconnected with Oramet, the congregation where she grew up, teaching in Oramet School, acting as school director from 2012 to 2017, and becoming passionate about humanistic Judaism as a source of meaning, connection, and inspiration. Rabbi Cohen was awarded her MA in Classical and Near East Studies from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, in January 2020, and received rabbinic ordination from the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism in May 2024. She lives with her husband and daughter in Minneapolis, and I'm happy to turn things over to her. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul, and great to see everyone. So, I'm going to be talking about Mishpatim. And Mishpatim, meaning laws, was the Torah portion for the Shabbat that just passed. And Terumah is the Torah portion for this week's Shabbat. Mishpatim is a really interesting portion, while Terumah, which gives instructions for building and decorating the tabernacle, is arguably one of the Torah's most boring. Unless you're very into cubit measures and plank counts. Maybe Terumah is for the construction managers. I'm not a construction manager, so I've decided to speak with you all about Mishpatim, which corresponds to Exodus 21:1 through 24:18. And I saw a comment in the chat, someone saying that they can't hear me very well. I'll try to speak a little louder and hopefully I'm coming through for you all. Um, so yeah, as I said, I'm talking about Mishpatim, which corresponds to Exodus 21:1 through 24:18. And I'm going to move through the portion in verse order, highlighting verses that are particularly interesting and or meaningful from a humanistic Jewish perspective. And as I discuss these verses, I'm going to use biblical scholar Jeffrey Teague's commentary from the Jewish Study Bible as my frame, while integrating my own analysis and insights from other scholars as well. And so before diving into the text itself, I want to situate it in a larger literary and cultural context. Most of Mishpatim is part of what scholars call the Covenant Code, the first of the Torah's four major law collections. The Covenant Code starts in Exodus 20 and then continues in our portion with a series of civil and criminal laws, followed by ethical and religious laws, including laws about worship. The code wraps up with an epilogue that promises rewards for being faithful to the law and warns against worshiping other gods. And the laws name a chieftain, not a king, as the highest official. So Tige suggests that they reflect the rules of a society of settled farmers and herders in the pre-monarchic period. And like Torah laws in general, they're not comprehensive or systematic, and they rarely give practical details on how they should be applied. They're likely more of an ideal or theoretical code than a set of working statutes for governing court or administrative decisions. As biblical scholars Thomas Kazin and Hilary Lipka elaborate, while we have no legal records from ancient Israel to compare with the content of the Torah laws to see how closely they may or may not correspond, thousands of legal records, mostly in the form of contracts, court records, and administrative documents, have been preserved from neighboring Mesopotamia. None of these legal records refer to any of the Mesopotamian law collections, nor do they judge according to them. It seems, therefore, that the ancient Near Eastern law collections were not used for judicial purposes. Rather than being used by judges for deciding individual cases, these law collections were probably used for the education of a scribal and intellectual elite, serving a pedagogical function. They were meant to foster a sense of justice and an understanding of difficult or borderline cases, offering illustrative examples and theoretical exercises rather than functioning as binding legal codes. So, in that spirit, let's dive into Mishpatim, understanding it not as a binding legal code, but instead as a text that gives insight into our ancient ancestors' sense of justice. And at this time, I'm going to share my screen um, with a PowerPoint which contains selections from, the text that I'm going to be talking about, as well as some additional notes highlighting, some specific points we'll be discussing. So our portion starts with the verse Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifanehem. These are the laws you shall set before them. And like all Torah portions, its name or title comes from the first significant word in its first verse, Mishpatim. And some general comments. Most of the laws in our portion that come after this verse are casuistic, meaning that they follow the formula of if slash when X happens, then Y shall happen. And this is typical of ancient Near Eastern law collections. Some of the laws that come after it are formulated, not casuistically, but apodictically, meaning that they sound like you shall blank or you shall not blank. They state unambiguously that you should, what you should or shouldn't do at all times and under all circumstances. And as we go through and highlight different laws, content wise, you'll find some continuities between them and other ancient Near Eastern laws. And you'll also note how these laws reflect a specifically Israelite worldview, an ancient Israelite worldview, vis a vis understanding of human value and concern for the marginalized. There's plenty to critique from a humanistic Jewish ethical perspective, and critique I will. But there's also plenty in which I find roots for our contemporary ethics. The laws in Exodus 21, 2 through 6, definitely fall into the not our ethics column. You can argue that verses 2 and 3, which limit the term of enslavement for an Eved Ivri, meaning a male Hebrew slave, to 6 years, and dictate that his wife shall go free with him, are humane laws that moderate the harshness of slavery as an institution that was unfortunately common across the ancient world. You can also argue that that framing is an apologetic and highlight, that the laws in Leviticus clarify what verse 2 here implies. While Hebrew slaves must be freed in the Jubilee year, slaves taken from among the people of surrounding nations and from among the Gerim, the immigrants in the Hebrews' midst, can be kept as slaves forever. So here we have separate, unequal standards for treatment of Ivrim versus Goyim and Gerim. Verses 4 through 6 describe a cruel situation where a slave opts to remain enslaved for life so that he isn't separated from his wife and children who can't go free. There's the strange ritual where his ear is pierced as a symbol of this lifetime bondage. His choice, if you can call it a choice, to remain a slave for life creates a contradiction with Leviticus 25:42, which stipulates that they are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. The rabbis try to make sense of this contradiction when they come, later on in the history of our tradition. They try to make sense of this contradiction, they try to harmonize it, and they argue that the ear piercing is a symbol of punishment. The ear heard the Holy One's voice on Mount Sinai declaring that they would only be his permanent servants and no one else's, and yet the Hebrew man decided to violate this command, and then his ear is pierced as a form of symbolically loaded punishment. This is really, I think, a great example of how later Jewish tradition responds to the biblical text, trying to make sense of ancient arcane customs and to reckon interpretively with a text that contains different legal traditions that contradict each other. If you understand the Torah as the holy word of God, not as a human text with multiple authors as we do, you need to see the whole Torah as perfect and complete and unerring, and you need to midrash away the contradictions. Turning to the next verses in Mishpatim, you can see how Exodus 21, 7 through 11 covers a special case, what Jeffrey Tigay terms as that of a father selling his minor daughter for the purpose of marriage or concubinage in the purchaser's family. And while this practice was known across the ancient Near East as a way for poor families to make marriage provisions for their daughters, and while the laws in these verses provide some protection of the daughter's welfare, like preventing her from being sold to outsiders if the man who purchased her finds her displeasing, allowing her to go free if her basic needs aren't met, etc., the underlying practice is patriarchal and exploitative in ways that are pretty offensive to contemporary humanistic Jewish sensibilities. The next verse pivots in a different direction. One who fatally strikes another shall be put to death, or he who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death. This is Exodus 21, verse 12. And that second translation is, how it would read if we go with the more literal gendered translation, an ish is a man. So capital punishment for murder is something that doesn't fit our contemporary humanistic Jewish values. I think we can take that as a given. And I think it's something to examine in its historical context because there's more layers of meaning here that I think are significant for us. So unlike broader ancient Near Eastern law, biblical law doesn't allow compensation of the victim's family as an alternative to capital punishment. So by implication, biblical law argues that human life is priceless, that it's beyond economic value, as Tigay puts it. And this connects to ideas that we see reflected in the first Genesis creation story and in the Noahide covenant. The idea that human beings are priceless because they're created in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim, to be like gods on earth with dominion over it. And then, as a striking point of contrast, in the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation story, humans are kind of a contemptuous afterthought They're these like lowly beings. They're created from the blood of a dead god to essentially be slaves for the gods, slaves for the Babylonian pantheon of gods. And so, yeah, looking at those two creation stories side by side, we see, within the biblical one, more of an emphasis on this idea of human value, of, human lives as having, value and greater significance within the world and like the larger universe. And while our contemporary values reject the violence of capital punishment, in the ancient frame, we can see how making capital punishment for murder the universal standard was radical. It was a profound assertion of human dignity and value, pushing back on regional norms which treated human life as cheap and considered all but those at the top of the social hierarchy as expendable. Mhm. Let's see, the following verse designates a place of refuge for the person who commits manslaughter, who kills by accident, not by design. And then verse 14, which immediately follows it, tempers the mercy with a clarification. Anyone who kills through treachery, who commits murder, and tries to seek sanctuary will be taken from that sanctuary, from my very altar, and put to death. The subsequent verses, Exodus 21:15 through 17, are particularly out of step with our humanistic Jewish values in prescribing capital punishment for crimes that don't rise to the level of murder, including the crime of insulting one's parents, which could mean cursing one's parents. There's different interpretive perspectives on this. The ancients, they were deeply concerned about the destructive potential of curses. Like if you thought that a curse really could, unleash God's wrath on someone, that was to curse someone was a violent act. Um, and so thinking about that, imposing like a death penalty for, you know, striking one's parents, maybe even just for insulting them, for cursing them, in the tribal patriarchal context of the ancient Near East, obedience to parents was the foundation of the social order. And you can compare verse 15 to the 195th paragraph of Hammurabi's Code, which is a famous ancient Babylonian legal text composed hundreds of years before the biblical covenant code. And scholars generally believe that the biblical authors were familiar with Hammurabi's Code, and likely shaped their own laws in conscious dialogue with it. And so, where Hammurabi's code calls for cutting off the hands of a son who strikes his father, our comparable law in Mishpatim dials up the harshness and violence of the punishment, turning it into a death sentence. We could jokingly call the Mishpatim version not a win for nonviolent restraint, but yes, a win for gender parity, in that it's also stridently defending the rights of moms. That could be a frame. Um, and just as a sidebar, I want to call people's attention to a Hebrew phrase in verse 16, gonev ish, one who kidnaps another, literally a man thief. Gonev, which is a participle form of the Hebrew verbal root ganav, means a thief. And the Yiddish word for a thief, a gonef or a ganef, it derives, directly from that Hebrew. It's a part of our Yiddish lexicon that has that clear linkage. Uh, and the next set of verses, Exodus 21:18 through 21, legislate that capital punishment should not occur in cases where the victim is harmed but not mortally wounded, or in cases where the victim is a slave and doesn't die immediately. So in verses 20 and 21, we see the Torah impulse toward egalitarian justice at war with its impulse to uphold, really pretty deeply problematic human hierarchies. So a slave owner whose violent attack kills his slave is subject to capital punishment. This crime must be avenged. And by implication, the life of the enslaved person is just as priceless as the life of the wealthier, more socially powerful perpetrator. It's a law that protects slaves from extreme corporal punishment, and it doesn't make distinctions between Hebrew and non-Hebrew slaves. And yet, its power is undercut by the verse 21 qualifier that the crime is not to be avenged if the victim survives a day or two. So if the attack is brutal, but not quite brutal enough to kill instantly, all right, no problem, since the one is the other's property. So, from the perspective of the biblical authors, who here emphasize the slave's monetary value, undermining notions of universal human value beyond price, the perpetrator is either unlikely to have killed the slave intentionally, because this would be throwing away an investment, or is within his rights to have done so. So, again, not very humanistic. Verse 22 pivots in the direction of considering consequences for other bodily harm. When two or more parties fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact, the punishment to be based on reckoning. This is Exodus 21:22. Here we have a miscarriage, a pregnant woman miscarrying a fetus, but no other physical harm enacted. There's no capital punishment imposed on the fighter who pushed the woman. He has to pay a fine, financial damages. So, by implication, within this cultural framework, the fetus doesn't possess the priceless or infinitely valuable quality of personhood. It's a non-person whose value can be priced. Later rabbinic interpretation, rabbinic exegesis from the rabbis of the Talmud on until the modern day has built on this idea, arguing that a fetus isn't a person and that abortion is allowable. I think it's important to ground ourselves in the knowledge that there isn't one religious perspective on abortion. So, not just secular Jewish thought, but also religious Jewish thought upholds the right to an abortion and grounds that argument in the biblical text. Verses 23 through 25, again, still in Exodus 21, which turn toward other bodily harm, are arguably the most famous in Mishpatim, and they're the source of the title for my talk today. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. The biblical legislators are laying out a system of lex talionis, or punishment in kind, where harm caused is punished by equal mirror harm. The violence of this system, the way it seems to perpetuate cycles of revenge, strikes us first. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind is a common humanist plaint. I think it's a bumper sticker. And, again, I think, I agree with that contemporary perspective. And again, I think it's important to consider the system in a historical and cultural context. So, according to the biblical framework, damage to any human body is beyond price. It can only be punished through mirror physical harm, not through the payment of a fee or a fine. So compare this with the system that Hammurabi's code outlines, where harm to the body of an aristocrat is punished through talion, through mirror harm, but harm to the body of a common person or a slave is punished through payment of a fee. If he has destroyed the eye of a commoner or broken the bone of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver, right? Under Hammurabi's code, only the aristocrat, by implication, is endowed with priceless personhood, while prices can be put on the bodies and lives of everyone else lower in the hierarchy. And in being assigned that financial value, they're dehumanized, they're objectified. Biblical scholar Tikva Freimer-Kensky expresses the contrast in this way. The laws of Hammurabi distinguish between the social classes. Physical attacks against the Avilum are treated as crimes, while attacks against the Muskinum, whose exact status is still unclear, are still treated as torts, lesser offenses. In the Bible, where there is no class distinction among free men, all physical assaults are treated as crimes. The biblical authors are engaging in a radical reimagining of ancient Near Eastern legal norms here. And it's a radical reimagining in which our humanistic Jewish emphasis on the dignity and the priceless value of all people can find roots. It's interesting to trace the evolving interpretation of an eye for an eye in Jewish reception history. The Mishnah, the oldest collection of rabbinic law, flips from the biblical framework of talion as universal punishment to a rabbinic framework of financial damages as universal punishment. And later rabbinic arguments in the Talmud probe the rationale for this flip, pointing out how, among other reasons, it's impossible to perfectly mirror harm, to have like a perfect sort of mirror of harm be enacted when different people have different sized eyes, different levels of pain tolerance, etc. So if somebody pokes out my eye and then okay we should poke out their eye in punishment, like what if my eye is smaller than their eye is bigger, is that a perfect mirror? Those are some of the questions that like in some ways seem sort of silly and in other ways are profound. Those are some of the questions that the rabbis of the Talmud raise as reasons for why we would switch away from this talionic system to a financial based one. um but what's consistent with the earlier biblical law, though, is that the rabbinic law applies a universal standard of punishment. There's a price put on every body and every life. And so, without the lurking threat of violence to answer violence, there's still egalitarianism. No one person or subset of the social hierarchy is elevated above other people as priceless. And this conversation has relevance today, generally speaking, in terms of questions about the death penalty, but specifically as a bill advances in the Knesset that creates a discriminatory hierarchy within the law. It mandates the death penalty only in cases involving Palestinian suspects in the West Bank, preserves judicial discretion in comparable cases involving Israelis, and excludes altogether cases in which Israeli settlers kill Palestinian residents. The Society for Humanistic Judaism has signed on to a Jewish communal statement opposing this bill, and I encourage you all to sign relevant petitions and take other action to oppose the bill also. Our humanistic Jewish values find roots in the streams of our ancient tradition that treat punishment for violent harm not as a tool for discriminating and for hardening hierarchy, but as a reflection of universal equality and human value. In commenting on the rest of Mishpatim, I'm not going to follow such a granular verse by verse approach as I have up until this point. Instead, I'm going to point out some more highlights and lowlights, along with a few head scratchers, looking to offer more humanistic Jewish insight into the portion's big themes. So much of the rest of Exodus 21 is taken up by laws about a hypothetical goring ox, which find close parallels in Babylonian law, while again transforming the Babylonian legal inheritance by making talion, not financial damages, the punishment for harm caused. The biblical treatment subjects the ox to capital punishment for killing a human, and the owner, too, if they've repeatedly failed to keep watch over an ox in the habit of goring. And compare this with the Hammurabi treatment. If an ox be a goring ox, and it's shown that he is a gorer, and he do not bind his horns or fasten the ox up, and the ox gore a freeborn man and kill him, the owner shall pay 1/2 a mina in money. And just as a sidebar, I think these goring ox laws are like a great sort of example of how, the codes we're looking at, both the Covenant Code and Hammurabi's Code, these kinds of ancient Near Eastern legal codes were not like everyday case law. Like, I don't think people were constantly being gored by oxen. Like, life was dangerous, bad stuff happened, but that, like, very specific kind of harm, more kind of a theoretical example that was like good to think with and like a way for, within a particular cultural framework for people to express their values around justice and harm and protecting the community. Mm. The first chunk of Exodus 22 deals with harms to property, laws covering various scenarios involving theft, property damage, and negligence. While Hammurabi's code calls for capital punishment of a thief who can't pay restitution, and, as Tige expresses it, often prescribes death for property offenses, biblical law, which considers human life beyond economic value, does not. Lest we're in danger of giving Mishpatim's authors too much credit, the ethical and religious laws that make up Exodus 22:17 through 23:19 are kind of a classic grab bag of mixed biblical nuts. You shall not tolerate a sorceress. Literally, you shall not let a sorceress live, is followed closely by the command that whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord, aka Adonai, aka Yahweh, alone shall be prescribed. And then, following on these statements of cultic intolerance, of intolerance for religious practitioners and practices that challenge the supremacy of Yahwism and the franchise of Yahweh's priests, we encounter one of the Torah's many expressions, indeed one of Mishpatim's multiple expressions, of ethical concern for the welfare of the ger, expressions of ethical concern that aren't paralleled in other ancient Near Eastern law collections. You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I've quoted that more times than I can count over the last few months as I've been testifying before decision makers and speaking to my congregation and protesting the ICE occupation of the Twin Cities. Mishpatim's concern for the rights of vulnerable people extends to poor debtors who have only their clothing to offer as collateral. One of its laws mandates that if you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you must return it before the sun sets. It is the only available clothing. It is what covers their skin. In what else shall they sleep? A similar law appears in Deuteronomy 24. Intriguingly, archaeologists have discovered a 7th century BCE inscription from ancient Judah that's in the form of a letter, probably written by a scribe for a laborer, calling on an official to return the laborer's garment. The letter invokes a scenario that parallels the one described in Exodus 22:25 through 26, and seems to appeal to the same ethical values. When I had finished my reaping, at that time, a few days ago, he took your servant's garment, the laborer laments in the letter. All my companions will vouch for me, all who were reaping with me in the heat of the sun. My companions will vouch for me that truly I am guiltless of any infraction. So please return my garment. If the official does not consider it an obligation to return your servant's garment, then have pity upon him and return your servant's garment from that motivation. This letter, which gives us insight into working people's daily lives and concerns during the biblical period, offers evidence that the laws of Mishpatim are responding to some of those real concerns. Mishpatim also includes a couple of dietary laws. You shall be holy people to me. You must not eat flesh torn by beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. Exodus 22:30. And you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Exodus 23:19. The word terefa, meaning torn, is the Hebrew source for the Yiddish word treif, which in Yiddish describes all food that's not kosher. The instruction not to boil a kid in its mother's milk may reflect concern about cruelty to animals. There's another law in Mishpatim, Exodus 22:29, which states that male firstborn cattle and other herd animals can't be separated from their mothers for sacrifice until their 8th day of life. Later Jewish tradition interprets this law about not boiling the kid in its mother's milk more broadly, building a fence around the Torah, so to speak, and seeing it as a commandment not to mix milk or milk products with any meat. And I'm going to unshare my screen at this point. And just note that, I could continue to delve into the text, highlighting Mishpatim's discussion of the major festivals. There's legislation here and elsewhere in the Torah that gives directives for observing Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And these laws, in different places, they don't always agree or even use the same names for the festivals, reflecting a range of theological positions and traditions that developed in different historical stages. I could also touch on the epilogue to the Covenant Code, which promises that God will reward the people for following his laws by driving out the promised land's inhabitants and granting the Israelites supremacy over a territory that includes Canaan and beyond. This epilogue, in its fantasy of ethnic cleansing, embodies biblical values that we as humanistic Jews strongly reject. Finally, I could talk about the covenant ceremony that closes Mishpatim, where different sources are clearly woven together in a way that makes the narrative confusing. Moses is already on the mountain before this covenant code is even presented. But then wait, elders and priests go partway up the mountain with him. No, wait, only Joshua goes with him. Scratch that, he goes alone. The different narratives which are woven together clearly don't agree with each other. And I think this is the right place to close on the portion's final passage, which reflects its contradictory, complicated human authorship. So, as humanistic Jews studying Mishpatim, we respond to the humanness of this text in every contradictory sense of that word. We reject the values it espouses that are ethnocentric, that are violent, that are mired in patriarchy, hierarchy, exploitation, and supernaturalism. And at the same time, we recognize and honor in it a dawning, nascent sense of universal human value and of the universal right to egalitarian justice. That's the tree of life in our tradition, rooted in ancient Israelite soil, in ancient Judahite soil, whose branches shelter and uplift us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing and fascinating. And I'm sure we have some questions, but I'm going to go first. And then if folks want to put up their hands with questions. So you alluded to the Talmud as kind of litigating away some of the more violent punishments here. Is there a sense through, archaeology as to how much was this enforced? At what point did they litigate away an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Or was there actual, stoning of children for disrespecting their parents? Any idea, like when did because I know the Talmud was initially the oral law that then got written down. Was this being litigated almost immediately away, or was there a period when this was actually the law and it was enforced?
I mean, I think that's a good question. And, from like I guess like from what we know, like the archaeological evidence does not, necessarily tell us in a clear way, this person was punished in this way. And we don't have like we have sort of the Torah as like this ideal like legal code, but we don't have the records, from ancient Israel, from ancient Judah, that like would show us this is actually how courts are proceeding.
Hmm.
Like they rendered this judgment and now this is the punishment that we're actually imposing. So I mean, I think like I mean, I guess if we see this as like, reflective of a system of cultural values, like I do think there was a justice system, generally speaking, that was more retributive, like in the, like when you think about sort of like in yeah the context of like a quote unquote tribal society that's not super large, where you don't have a lot of centralized organization, and like the kind of the family unit, the kinship unit is sort of responsible for protecting the life and the safety of, the people within it. And it's like, okay, yeah, like this man killed somebody, and so now the family of that person killed is going to, come back and kill. So like I think, I mean, to an extent, that is reflective of probably what was happening. In terms of some of the laws, like, like you will be killed if you're, you curse your parents. Like, I mean, I think there's debate about that, and the question whether, do these more represent kind of, it's like, you say this scary thing as like a deterrent, but whether, this was actually, done in practice.
Right. Fascinating. And Martin writes in the chat about American law with some contemporary parallels, like taking away many of a criminal's human rights as supposed punishment. Do you see any examples of such parallels anywhere in the world? You touched on the contradictory Israeli laws. And of course, we do have states in the US that administer the death penalty still, which you did talk about the humanistic approach against that for the most part. There is someone very active in our humanistic Judaism discussion group on Facebook who is part of a group called Jews Against the Death Penalty.
Mm.
So I know that there is a movement of Jewish people who are openly against the death penalty, but that certainly seems like a kind of selective application of this ancient code of law.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think, to your question, Martin, I think we could say that that's the case. Yeah, I think everywhere in every country, in every legal system, cases in which, like, yeah, justice is not actually being administered in like an egalitarian, universal, fair way. I mean, and yeah, looking to the United States right now, looking to what's happening in my state, in my city, like really, I mean, like we're seeing, cases where, in the like in immigration court, the human rights of, of immigrants are being violated, things that in theory are supposed to be, protected by our justice system, regardless of a person's immigration status, that's not being honored. And then, yeah, I mean, the discriminatory ways in which so many laws are enforced, the discriminatory, application of the death penalty itself, whether, it's even if this is not, de jure, like it's a de facto discriminatory application, like if, a murderer who is not white is, I believe, yeah, more likely to be sentenced to the death penalty. And then also, this is an interesting layer to it. If the victim is not white, I think when you look at the stats, the murderer is also less likely to be sentenced to the death penalty. Um, so yeah, and I think if there was any confusion, I don't think so. My argument in looking at Mishpatim is not that we should bring back the death penalty. No, 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 no. But my argument is basically that like we need to be universal and egalitarian in our approach to law and to justice and to punishment. And I think, we see this sort of dawning sense of that in Mishpatim, which is, not necessarily echoed in other, legal codes of its place and period or anywhere else in the world that we know of. And I think that, that is a strand in our tradition that I take pride in, and, I find some roots, for my humanistic Jewish identity.
I don't often or rarely do I grapple with the actual text, and I think most secular Jews also don't. But when I do, like today, it really is remarkable how much is in there that we look at through a modern lens and say, wow, this is so distant and different than what we want to see in the world as far as justice goes. And then I'm reminded by how cherry-picked it is by political forces in the United States. Like the whole argument against LGBTQ equality comes out of the Jewish Bible because it's not mentioned in the New Testament. So it's just bizarre that that how much of this is ignored. All of the stuff about how to treat your slave, how to compensate for the injury of slaves or the death of slaves as you're going through, and then to have folks say this is all the word of God. Like even in the Jewish tradition, how do folks make the case that I'm curious, do you have a sense of how like an Orthodox believer would make the case that this is the actual word of God transcribed by Moses on Sinai about what, that slavery is fine? How do they justify it?
I mean, I think a piece of that Orthodox framework is like understanding both the written Torah and the quote unquote oral Torah, Mishnah and Talmud, as all being, the words of the living God. And so, like, I mean, I think that's how they make sense of it for themselves theologically. It's like, okay, this, so like both, yeah, the Torah text and the rabbinic interpretation and argument about how, actually this is what it means, like that's all the sacred text, and therefore our our reinterpretation, our midrash can, we can take that as being, maybe the sort of the like the ultimate update, or like, yeah, don't stone the rebellious son, don't, like, yeah. So I think it's, and for if you're coming from like a secular humanistic Jewish perspective, like that doesn't work for you cognitively, that doesn't work for you theologically. But I think that that's how they do it. And I guess where there is a connection to what we do is what they're doing is they're authorizing their kind of the way their tradition develops, the way the interpretive tradition develops, and they're saying, this is valid, new ways of interpreting are valid. And like we say that, without needing to say, that, they're valid because they're divinely authorized. But we're saying that, yeah, our new ways of doing Jewish and being Jewish are valid.
Someone want to jump in with a question or thought or response?
I just want to thank Eva for her very thoughtful and very multifaceted interpretations and analysis. Um, I would expect nothing less from you, Eva.
Oh, thanks so much, Jeffrey. That means a lot. And yeah, I think probably most folks know, but if not, Jeffrey and I were classmates in the IISHJ rabbinical program. So we've had a lot of opportunity to learn together, and I've learned a lot from Jeffrey, and it's great to have him on today.
Peter?
Hi, I just want to preface it with my question. In the musical theater, there are little songs, the big songs everybody remembers.
Mm,
So whereas Mashpatim may be more of the mid level songs we sort of remember, and you said the next one is very boring, so that may be the little song everyone forgets.
yep.
So with that in mind, where does Mashpatim come in as, and what's the overall takeaway? Because we're in Exodus now and we're leading up to Passover. So all this starts um, coming all together. If you read it weekly, it all starts making sense when you do the Haggadah and some things pop out. So the main takeaway from today's Parsha.
Hmm. I mean, I guess for me, the main takeaway is, that this parsha in the best and the worst ways expresses our humanness. And I think the thing that we find roots in, and that I think, many other liberal Jewish movements find roots in, is, what in this parsha insists on the pricelessness of human life and upon systems of universal egalitarian justice. That's, I think, yeah, the best part.
Andy?
Yes, first, thank you, Rabbi Eva, for a fascinating presentation. Just reading through this with you, I noticed how much of the Parsha is written in God's name, but yet we believe, humans were authors. So, what was the humans' approach? Did they believe they were, in a sense, communicating God's word, or was it just a big con, or is it something in between?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Um, hmm. I mean, I think probably, I mean, maybe you could say this about, true believers and, con artists, and, where's the line? I think, across history, across religious movements, you know maybe, yeah, probably both. And I mean, I think in that, earlier period in history, like, we're talking, like, and there's, of course, debates around the exact dating, and then the question too of, when was this written down versus, when was it circulating orally, when was it redacted. But, we're talking, more than 2,500 years ago. I mean, at a time where, people did not have the same understandings about, like, the scientific operation of the universe. Like, I think probably I'd say probably, a lot of them were probably true believers, in the sense, that they believed, that this was right and this was what's true. And, we think, like, scholars think that, like, most of the Torah's authors were members of, a scribal elite, a priestly elite. So, I mean, yeah, like, they were invested in, like, a particular interpretation of God's word or Yahweh's word. And, they wanted, people to be, like, following their cult, sacrificing at their sanctuaries. So there's yeah, there's belief, and there's self-interested reasons to believe.
Uh, Judy?
Thank you for the really thoughtful presentation. I always find it interesting to go through these Torah portions because I wrestle with one thing that you had said earlier about the cherry picking. And we don't like when the far right cherry pick to meet their needs, to impose all sorts of things that are egregious or non-egalitarian. And we're kind of doing the same thing, picking out the things we do like. And I wrestle with how valid of a document it is, therefore, to even be looking to when we're all cherry picking. And I don't know. I don't really have a question. It's just something that I wrestle with, especially as you talk about and looking at these that are so arcane, most of them, and we can't interpret them to bend to our way. So we're just going to ignore it in the same fashion that those on the far right will do the same thing. Anyway.
Yeah, so thank you for raising that, Judy. And I think that wrestling and those questions are really important. And I think what I would say is, for us as humanistic Jews, and this is something that I try to stand in, as a rabbi, like we are not pretending that all the bad stuff and all the bad stuff we or all the stuff we don't agree with isn't there. Like a bit like a chunk of what we're doing and like a chunk of what I did today is being honest about like this and this and this and this are, things that people said, that people wrote, that people have argued that we find abhorrent or we find, problematic or we find like head scratching. Like we're going to be honest about those things and we're going to keep being honest about those things. And we're also going to say, these and these and these are the things that we find value in, that we affirm, that we love, that we draw strength from. And I think, it's like in the same way, I think, it's important to be honest about like all of our human inheritances or, thinking about like if maybe you come from a difficult family background, all kinds of things like that, being honest and being real about like all the things that are bad, all the things that you reject, and all the things that you love, all the things that you find value and affirmation in. So I think like I want us to continue to stand in that place of being honest and being real in our reception of and our framing of our Jewish inheritance. And just acknowledging the fact that it's human in the best and the worst and the most middling or mid kinds of ways. It's all of those things.
It's an excellent answer. And it is, I just want to add a little bit also because it's getting really at the heart of some of the advocacy work that we do in our movement, which is that I certainly believe that secular people in the US just don't have the numbers to do it alone. But there are many, many liberal religious people who stand with us on all of the issues, including abortion access. And so we have to build bridges between secular and liberal religious people. And I know Eva is doing that in the Twin Cities, in coalition with other faith leaders who are liberal in outlook and may have a similar approach to the text source. But in like Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism, when they talk about LGBTQ equality, they draw from the text and they will say, because we're all created in God's image. And when they have a sign-on letter with that sentence, I ask them, can you add or edit that to say, our tradition teaches we were all created in the image of God. And they make the change, which is lovely because they want to include us. And we can sign on to that because that's a factual statement. But we can't simply walk away from it. And I had mentioned in the chat that this Torah portion is always the Shabbat that a National Council of Jewish Women does their Repro Shabbat on every year because of that text from abortion. Our Jews for Secular Democracy initiative is pluralistic. So when we're talking about reproductive rights, which we do see as a separation of church and state issue, we bring the Jewish religious tradition to it, which is this text exactly. But we also are able to bring the secular humanistic approach as well, which is, I don't care what the ancient rabbis had to say about this, right? This is about bodily autonomy and it's about medical decisions. So we bring all of that. But I don't think we're going to be able to turn back the tide of fundamentalism just by secular approaches alone, unfortunately. I wish that was an option. It may be in other countries around the world. In the United States, there's still just a huge percentage of people who see the world through a religious lens, but there are many who see it through a liberal religious lens, kind of like what we're talking about today. But I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. This was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Eva, for this. And we look forward to having you back, and we will do this again next month as well. You'll see it in your emails. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, Eva.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. It's great to be here with you. And Shabbat. Oh, I was going to say Shabbat Shalom tomorrow.
Close enough. Close enough. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.